The hallway outside the Copa room at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas was narrow, institutional, the kind of space where fame stopped and consequence began. It was late March 1961. Inside, 2,000 people were waiting for Frank Sinatra to take the stage. Outside, in that corridor, 3 men stood in silence. Frank leaned against the wall, perfectly still. His tuxedo was immaculate. His face was unreadable. Across from him stood a younger man, mid-30s, thin, nervous, a road manager whose name most people never learned. Behind both of them, a casino executive in a dark suit, arms crossed, waiting. Something had gone wrong, badly wrong, and someone was going to pay for it. The younger man's hands were shaking, not dramatically, just enough that when he reached into his jacket pocket for a cigarette, the pack rattled. Frank watched him, didn't speak, just watched. The casino executive broke the silence, asked a direct question about responsibility, about authorization, about who made the decision that had just cost the hotel a significant problem with very dangerous people. Frank could have answered with one word, one sentence, could have taken the weight off the younger man's shoulders with a simple acknowledgement. He didn't. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10, an eternity in a corridor where careers lived and died. And then the younger man spoke, voice barely steady, said what he'd been taught to say, what loyalty demanded he say. "It was me. Mr. Sinatra had nothing to do with it." Frank's expression didn't change. He straightened his bow tie, adjusted his cufflinks, walked past both men toward the stage door. The crowd beyond erupted into applause as he entered. Behind him, the younger man's career ended without another word spoken. In the world of Frank Sinatra, loyalty wasn't just about what you did for him, it was about what you were willing to lose for him. To understand what happened in that corridor, you have to understand the court of Frank Sinatra. Not his public life, not the recording sessions or the film sets or the performances that millions watched. The private world, the inner circle, the ecosystem of people whose livelihoods depended entirely on Frank's mood remaining stable. It was a complicated hierarchy. At the top, Frank himself. Beneath him, layers of people with varying degrees of access and vulnerability. Musicians, managers, valets, assistants. Men whose entire professional identity was built around proximity to power. The road manager, the one in that corridor, had been with Frank for 3 years. Not a long time in the grand scheme, but long enough to understand the rules. Rule 1, Frank was always right. Not philosophically, practically. Whatever Frank said became reality because Frank had the power to make it reality. Rule 2, problems were solved before Frank learned about them. You anticipated, you prevented, you fixed, quietly. Rule 3, if something went wrong anyway, you never, under any circumstances, made Frank look bad. Not to the press, not to business partners, not to anyone who mattered. The road manager understood these rules, lived by them. His job was to make Frank's life frictionless, to handle logistics, to smooth conflicts, to ensure that when Frank walked into a room, everything was exactly as Frank expected it to be. He was good at his job, competent, loyal, the kind of loyalty that doesn't announce itself but shows up in 1,000 small actions, being available at 3 a.m., remembering preferences, anticipating needs. Those close to Frank learned to read micro-expressions, the slight tightening around his eyes that meant someone had annoyed him, the way he'd set down his drink with just a little too much force, the pause before responding that meant he was calculating whether this person was still useful. Living in that atmosphere was exhausting. You were constantly performing, constantly aware that one mistake, one moment of being in the wrong place with the wrong information could end everything. The road manager knew men who'd been exiled from Frank's circle, not dramatically,
just quietly stopped receiving calls, quietly discovered that doors which had been open were now closed. He knew what exile meant in this world. It meant starting over, somewhere smaller, somewhere without the prestige or the money or the proximity to power that had become normal. He was determined never to be that person, which is why, when the incident happened, he made the choice he made.
The incident itself was almost mundane, the kind of small mistake that, in another context, would have been fixable, forgettable. But context was everything, and the context was Las Vegas in 1961, where the Sands was more than a hotel. It was territory, connected territory. According to those who were present, the problem started earlier that day. Frank had been scheduled for a meeting, a courtesy meeting with certain men whose influence in Las Vegas was absolute and whose respect was non-negotiable. The meeting was supposed to happen at 4 p.m. Private room, discreet, important. But Frank's schedule had shifted. A recording session ran long, or Frank had decided to sleep late, or Frank simply changed his mind about the timing. Sources differ on the specifics. What's not disputed, the meeting didn't happen at 4 p.m. The road manager, trying to manage the situation, made calls, explained the delay, rescheduled for 6 p.m., assured people that Frank would absolutely be there at 6. Frank wasn't consulted about this. That was the road manager's job, to handle schedule changes, to make executive decisions that kept things running smoothly. But 6 p.m. came, and Frank wasn't there. Not because Frank forgot, because Frank had gone to the golf course, had decided, apparently on impulse, that the afternoon was better spent outside. When someone from his entourage mentioned the rescheduled meeting, Frank waved it off, said he'd get there when he got there. The men waiting at 6 p.m. were not accustomed to waiting. By 7 p.m., the situation had escalated. Phone calls were made, increasingly tense phone calls, the kind where words are carefully chosen, but the message is unmistakable. This is a sign of disrespect. And disrespect in that world, in that city, had consequences. The road manager was in an impossible position. Frank was still at the golf course, unreachable or unwilling to be reached. The men who'd been stood up were demanding an explanation, an apology, assurance that this wasn't intentional. The road manager made a decision, called the men directly, apologized profusely, said there had been a miscommunication, that the 6 p.m. time had been set without Frank's knowledge, that Frank had never been informed of the meeting. It was a lie designed to protect Frank from appearing disrespectful, a lie that shifted blame away from Frank's indifference and onto the road manager's supposed incompetence. The men accepted the explanation, grudgingly, with the understanding that heads would roll. When Frank finally arrived at the Sands that evening, he was in good spirits. The golf had gone well. He was ready for the show. That's when they told him about the problem, about the meeting he'd missed, about the men who were now insulted, about the apology that had been issued on his behalf. Frank's mood shifted, not visibly, but those who knew him could feel it. The temperature in the room dropped. The casino executive who came to explain the situation was careful, diplomatic, but the message was clear. This couldn't happen again. These particular men couldn't be disrespected, even accidentally, and someone needed to take responsibility for what had just occurred. The executive asked Frank directly, had he authorized the road manager to reschedule without consulting the other party first? Frank looked at the road manager. The younger man's face had gone pale. He understood what was happening, understood that Frank could either acknowledge his own role, admit that he'd gone golfing instead of attending a meeting he'd committed to, or he could let the lie stand. The lie that made the road manager look incompetent, made him the source of the disrespect instead of Frank. Witnesses later recalled the length of that silence, how nobody moved, how the road manager seemed to be holding his breath, waiting for Frank to say something, anything. Frank could have told the truth, could have said he'd changed plans without informing anyone, could have taken the diplomatic hit to his reputation, which, given his stature, would have been minimal. But taking responsibility would have meant admitting fault, would have meant appearing careless or disrespectful, would have meant losing face, even slightly, in front of men whose opinion of him mattered. So Frank said nothing. The silence communicated everything. Communicated that Frank wasn't going to correct the record, wasn't going to contradict the story that had already been told, wasn't going to save the road manager from the consequences of the lie that had been told to save Frank. The road manager understood. In that moment, he understood completely. Loyalty was a one-way transaction. He'd protected Frank, and Frank was going to let him suffer for it. He could have spoken up, could have said, "Actually, I did clear it with Mr. Sinatra," could have tried to spread the blame. But that would have made Frank a liar, would have embarrassed Frank in front of the casino executive, would have broken the cardinal rule, never make Frank look bad. So the road manager did what loyalty demanded, took it all on himself, confirmed that he'd acted without authorization, apologized for the confusion he'd caused. Frank's only response was a slight nod, not of sympathy, of acknowledgement. The matter had been settled. He had somewhere to be. He walked past both men without another glance, toward the stage door, toward the applause, toward the audience that was waiting. Behind him, the casino executive looked at the road manager with something between pity and contempt. "You're done here. Pack your things tonight."
Frank's show that night was flawless. He sang with the control and charisma that had made him a legend. The audience adored him. He told jokes between songs, seemed relaxed, happy. From the stage, you couldn't see the corridor where a man's career had just ended. Couldn't see the office where he was being processed out. Couldn't see any evidence that something had gone wrong. That was the point. The machinery of Frank's world was designed to be invisible. Problems were solved backstage. Consequences happened out of sight. The audience saw only perfection. The road manager cleared out his small office that night. Few personal belongings. He'd traveled light, always ready to move when Frank moved. A few changes of clothes, some notebooks with phone numbers and schedules, a photograph of his family that he kept in a drawer. According to one account, someone from the venue's management came to verify he was actually leaving, to make sure there was no confusion, no attempt to stay, no appeal to Frank for mercy. There was no appeal. The road manager knew better. Frank had made his decision. Questioning it would only make things worse. Did Frank feel guilt? Did he think about the road manager after that night? Those who knew Frank suggest the answer is complicated. Frank wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. He didn't enjoy watching people suffer. But he also didn't let guilt interfere with what he believed was necessary. In Frank's worldview, this was the cost of operating at his level. People around him took risks. Sometimes those risks didn't work out. That was the nature of the business. The road manager had made a call. The call had consequences. That he'd made the call to protect Frank was, in Frank's mind, what he was being paid for. Protection wasn't supposed to be convenient or safe. It was supposed to be absolute. There's a phrase that gets used about men like Frank Sinatra. Heavy is the head that wears the crown. But perhaps what's heavier is the neck that supports it, the weight carried by those beneath, the price paid by people whose names don't appear in history books, who take the blame, who disappear into footnotes. Frank walked out of that venue at 2 a.m., was driven back to his suite, slept, woke up the next day, and continued his life exactly as before. The road manager took a Greyhound bus out of Las Vegas the following morning, returned to a city where no one knew his name, started over in a profession that had nothing to do with entertainment or proximity to fame. The transaction was complete.
The road manager's name, his real name, has been lost to history. Not because records don't exist, but because people who might remember have chosen not to speak. because the story reflects poorly on a legend, and legends must be protected. What's known is that he never worked at that level again, never returned to the orbit of major entertainment figures. Whatever connections he'd built during his years with Frank evaporated the moment he was exiled. In Hollywood and Las Vegas, word travels. An unspoken understanding developed. This man was the one who'd created problems between Frank and certain connected individuals. Whether that was true or not didn't matter. Perception was reality, and the perception made him radioactive. According to second-hand accounts, the road manager found work eventually. Lower-level management at venues that didn't ask too many questions about gaps in employment history. Steady work. Forgettable work. He didn't speak publicly about what happened, not in interviews, not in memoirs, either because he'd signed something that prevented it, or because he understood that speaking would only hurt him further. There are rumors, impossible to verify, that Frank sent money years later, an envelope with cash and no return address, a way of acknowledging the sacrifice without having to say it out loud, without having to admit publicly that a wrong had occurred. If the money came, it would have been substantial. Frank was capable of generosity, of quiet gestures that balanced ledgers in his own mind. But money doesn't restore a career, doesn't give back the years spent in exile, doesn't erase the memory of standing in a corridor while someone you'd been loyal to chose silence instead of truth. The isolation of Frank Sinatra was complete by the end of his life. He'd outlived most of his contemporaries, was surrounded by people who'd learned the same lesson the road manager had learned. Don't expect Frank to save you. When everyone around you takes the blame, you never learn from your mistakes. You never develop the muscle of accountability. You never have to confront the cost of your decisions because someone else is always paying it. Frank Sinatra died in 1998. The obituaries were glowing, celebrated his music, his films, his impact on American culture, called him the greatest entertainer of the 20th century. None mentioned the men who'd taken falls for him, who'd absorbed consequences so Frank could remain untouchable, who'd carried weight so Frank could appear weightless. We love legends. We need them. We build them up because they represent something larger than ourselves. Talent, charisma, the ability to bend the world through sheer force of personality. Frank Sinatra was all of those things, genuinely. His talent was undeniable. His impact on music history is permanent. The pleasure his work has brought to millions is real. But legends are complicated. They're built not just through individual genius, but through systems, through people who support and protect, and, when necessary, sacrifice. The road manager was one of dozens, maybe hundreds, people whose proximity to Frank required them to accept terms that weren't negotiable, that required them to understand that loyalty meant being willing to lose for him. Some of those people survived their time with Frank and went on to other successes. Others didn't. Others found that being exiled from Frank's world meant being exiled from opportunities more broadly, that the cost of their loyalty was higher than they'd understood when they signed on. Frank's choice in that corridor, the choice to stay silent, to let the road manager take the blame, wasn't unique. It was pattern, a pattern repeated throughout his career, a pattern that powerful people have relied on throughout history. The question isn't whether Frank Sinatra was a villain. He wasn't. He was a human being with enormous talent and enormous power, operating in a world where power was currency and vulnerability was death. The question is what we do with complicated legacies, how we hold space for both the music and the methods, for both the legend and the cost of building it. Frank Sinatra sang My Way, sang about doing things on his own terms, about facing the final curtain and being able to say he'd lived without compromise. But the men who took falls for him, they lived with compromise, lived with the knowledge that loyalty wasn't reciprocal, that they'd been used and discarded and forgotten. We remember Frank. We remember the voice, the swagger, the legend. We don't remember them. Frank Sinatra walked away clean that night. The spotlight followed him. The applause surrounded him.
He sang, and the audience loved him, and nothing in his performance suggested that anything had gone wrong. But looking back now, decades later, perhaps the real weight wasn't carried by the man who wore the crown. Perhaps the man who took the blame carried less weight than the man who let him do it.